Now, South Africa has approached the International Court of Justice under the Genocide Convention. This is with respect to acts committed by Israel in the context of its attacks on Gaza. Government has raised concerns over the plight of civilians caught in the Israeli attacks on the Gaza Strip. This is due to the indiscriminate use of force and forcible removal of inhabitants. International Relations spokesperson Clayson Monyela says the South African government has repeatedly stated that it condemns all violence and attacks against all civilians, including Israelis. So we speak on this. We're joined by Lebohang Pheko, who's a senior research fellow and political economist at the Trade Collective. Ms. Pheko, thank you so much for your time on the agenda today. First, let's just start off by getting your reaction to South Africa filing an urgent application at the International Court of Justice. This is also accusing, of course, on those accusations. Yeah.
Sure. So, I think the first thing is that it's important that South Africa has taken this stand, particularly as a country that has understood settler colonialism and apartheid very clearly in the past. It's a show of international solidarity, but it's also a reminder that we do have a particular affinity to the cause. Secondly, I think that we are on the correct side of history and her story in this instance, because I think that speaking about the Genocide Convention, understanding, the claim that has been put forward to the ICC speaks about the racialization of settler occupation inflicted by the Israeli state. It also speaks about the importance of humanitarianism. It also speaks about the importance of ensuring that civilians are in no part of the collateral damage of this supposed war, but it's actually an aggression and disproportionate aggression of Israel upon the people of Palestine. And quite importantly, and lastly, it makes a clear distinction between Hamas as a resistance group and the people of Palestine, the civilians, the women, the children, and the men who are caught up in this extremely disproportional and extremely violent crossfire.
And let's talk about, how does the Genocide Convention define the crime of genocide?
The Genocide Convention actually speaks about the attempt to annihilate an entire people. It speaks about some of the things I've already mentioned about proportionality. It is also an act of intent and aggression. So I think that unlike many other acts of war, which perhaps would be seen as unforeseeable, where the casualties and the level of casualties would be seen as unknowable beforehand. The distinction here is that genocide is an act of commission. It is an act of intentionality, and that is exactly what the Statute of Rome also speaks to. And there are previous precedents to this. We have precedents, for example, the war that took place, the fall of Czechoslovakia, the Bosnian War, where in fact I think for the first time genocide was seen as a war crime, and also rape as an act of war and an act of aggression, and so forth. We've also seen, of course, previously with Rwanda, where this was seen as an act of complicitness and an act of commission. And this is where the act of genocide cannot be seen as a mere act of war among other wars.
And of course, Israel has rejected the charge, with Israeli Foreign Ministry spokesperson, writing on X, formerly Twitter, that Israel rejects with disgust the blood libel spread by South Africa and its application to the ICJ. What does this mean? Does this mean that now the battle lines have been drawn between Israel and South Africa?
Well, it remains to be seen, but as we know in politics, there are no permanent friends or enemies, but certainly the relationship between Israel and South Africa has become increasingly frosty, one might say, particularly since we have formally closed diplomatic relations and asked closed the Israeli embassy and the Israeli mission to South Africa. It also means that, of course, it remains to be seen whether then this means that there'll be shift in relations between and the extent to which Israel is able to mobilize its own allies, specifically the United States, and specifically countries like the United Kingdom within the EU, because even the European Union as a bloc are not a coherent grouping on the Zionist Israeli issue, which is very important to note. And I think it also remains to be seen whether or not their allies, their strong allies, are themselves willing to become persona non grata tend to become alienated either economically, politically going forward, because as we appreciate in the realm of international relations, these are not only short-term issues, these are also long-term, broader scale issues. And, as you know very well, Buti, that, my enemies are not necessarily your enemies in the realm of international relations. So other countries, although it's tempting for people to think that perhaps we are the ones who should be cautious as South Africa, but I think that every country should be cautious as to who they consort with, how they make alliances, build alliances, and break those alliances, and think about the long-term costs and implications of what these actions may or may not have.
And on that very same breath, I think the Foreign Affairs spokesperson also went on to accuse South Africa of cooperating with what he calls a terrorist organization that is calling for the destruction of Israel. Let's get your view on this.
I think that it's extremely regrettable that we are in a realm where there's so little nuance and such a strong, an ethical, the compass of ethics, of international ethics and human ethics is so skewed that acts of terror and acts of state aggression, as they have been conducted by a country like Israel, are actually then in some way moderated, defended, and viewed as somehow defensible, in fact. And I think that this false equivalency, for example, between a settler colony, a settler colonized state like Palestine, which is under-resourced, versus a militarized state, a military state like Israel, who are then trying to pretend that there's an equivalency, and are also trying to act as though anybody who speaks against them are then anti-Semitic and so forth. And even the languaging, the nuance is extremely difficult, and makes it difficult to then see the trees within the woods. But I also think that what's also been important in this is that it reminds many of us who have been the subjects of settler colonialism and international international relations as well, of in fact how easy it is to lose sight of what is correct and what is incorrect. And I think that what's been very important in the last few weeks, in the midst of the atrocities and of, I think, the horrible, grim, graphic images that we've been seeing coming out of Palestine and out of the Gaza Strip, is a reminder of how, in fact, these sorts of international power relations continue to construct and reconstruct themselves. And I think that it's also important that we remember where we ourselves come from. It is of no surprise that, of course, that Israel is bound to be defensive and bound to be quite hostile and slightly arrogant about this. And I also think that they're running out of legroom in the international arena.
And speaking of those nuances that you touched on, is Israel breaching its obligation under the Genocide Convention?
They have been. I think even the idea of Israel, Buti, in and of itself is deeply contested. The idea of Israel is one that we have seen being, we saw with for example, the passing of Henry Kissinger, the reminders of the concessions that have been made in this regard. What is today modern day Palestine versus what was originally agreed on problematically, in the 1940s, 75 years ago, is hardly one-fifth of what existed at the time. So you can imagine if, for example, if South Africa had received our independence in 1994, such as it is, and then we had seen a slow incursion back into, for example, being forced into a space the size of, say, former Bophuthatswana, if we'd then been forced into a territory the size of KwaZulu, how absolutely egregious that we would find this. And this is exactly what Israel has been able to get away with over the last 75 days, with the complicity of some very elasticated interpretations, particularly under the guidance and the tutelage of the United States in particular. And they almost seem to have a international trans-state status among the body of polity, of international polity. So, for example, any other country which had tried this sort of aggression would either have been dissolved by now or would have met with immense resistance by international powers. And when I say international, read that as Euro-US powers.
And of course, just quickly before I let you go, what will a decision by the International Court of Justice mean? And would that decision in particular be final?
Yeah, those decisions, Buti, have very little locus standi, only because of the fact that it takes, firstly, a long time to even get a sitting. There have been laundry lists of war crimes that have been committed over decades, which to date have not been adjudicated by the ICC. There have also been, of course, there are already issues around even the ICJ as whether or not it's actually per se a neutral arbiter of these issues. Some of these issues can take years to be met. So I think we should view this per se as placing on record in the strongest term our own dissatisfaction, anger, and disapproval of this. But in terms of it being actually bearing any fruit legally, I think it's very unlikely. Also bear in mind that the cost of litigation is extremely expensive. And then, that it's a game of attrition. It takes years and years. And only with political support and political will have the really high profile cases actually been heard. So, when you have a Charles Taylor, for example, who is tried at the cost of millions and millions of dollars US. And I think that, many people, of course, are already unhappy with the notion that, the ICJ as a construct, as an idea, is itself, in some respects, very much oftentimes acting in the interests that are not per se for African countries and for countries of the global south. So I think we should be very modest in our expectations, but I do still think that in terms of our own jurisprudence, developing African-centered international jurisprudence, that shows that we have a voice in international matters that is very loud and important. That is the significance of this.
All right, that's Lebohang Pheko. She's Senior Research Fellow and Political Economist at the Trade Collective. Thanks very much indeed for your insights.